I'm Daniel Cullen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this second of two conversations on the 2020 election sponsored by Rhodes College, Project for the Study of Liberal Democracy, and the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. We'll have 1 hour for the webinar, and I'll ask you to enter any questions you have at any time into the Q&A box. You'll notice there's no chat box, so just please type your questions in there. My guest is my colleague and my good friend, Michael Nelson, the Fulmer Professor of Political Science at Rhodes College. Mike is a leading scholar of the American presidency, and he's also a prolific one. So much so that, as you saw from the poster, we'd use up most of our webinar time if I related all of his works. I'd like to point out a few recent ones, however, which alone would make for a distinguished career. Resilient America, electing Richard Nixon in 1968, which won the prestigious Richard Neustadt Prize for Scholarship on the American Presidency. Trump's first year, followed by Trump the first 2 years. And then apparently Mike succumbed to Trump fatigue because he published a book last April on Bill Clinton's elections of 1992 and 1996, the birth of a new era of governance. And in a moment, I'll ask him to expound on that. He will soon publish another volume on the 2020 elections once they're finally over. And that will be coming out from the University of Virginia Press. You won't be able to be with your family for Christmas, but you can still send them a nice book. Mike, one of your hallmarks has always been to bring historical understanding to political analysis. What is it about the 1968 election that you think sheds some light on the present? The term resilient America seems like one that's apropos.
Well, that's a spoiler alert, because for those of us who lived through 1968, and by the way, for students here, 1968 was probably as remote to your life experience as the U.S. entry into World War I was for mine, which occurred about as far back from when I was a college student as you are from 1968. But understand that 1968 was a year that makes this year look, in some ways, tame, certainly manageable, because it was one unending series of crises after another. The assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, riots in the streets of Chicago during the Democratic National Convention, the challenge to the incumbent president within his own party, which resulted in President Johnson surprisingly simply withdrawing from the race. And all through that year, and here I see some more direct connection with 2020, the angry and yet highly resonant candidacy of former Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who rubbed the nation's racial resentments, rubbed the nation's class resentments, and aroused the same sort of white working class coalition of outrage that Donald Trump tapped into 4 years ago and tapped into again this year. So I see, in that sense, a reassuring lesson from 1968, that we are an incredibly resilient country. The constitutional system was able to take a country that seemed to be coming apart at the system and get us through that and bring us back together. But I also see some disturbing echoes of and Wallace, by the way, carried 4 states and gained 13% of the national popular vote. So in some ways, he was a bit of foreshadowing for what's happened in the years since then, in many ways culminating, finding their ultimate expression in the candidacy 4 years ago and then the presidency of President Trump.
In your book on the Clinton elections, And referring to 1992, 1996, you have a line in the preface about divided government where you say both parties act as if the other party must be conquered, not just defeated. And that also seems to create a parallel with the present. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that. And also later in the book, you discuss the rebuke to Clinton that the 1994 midterms represented. There was a rebuke of the Trump administration in the 2018 midterms. You write that Clinton learned something important from his experience. Trump didn't really seem to change course, and yet the 2020 results didn't follow the 2018 results. They look more like the 2016 results. What can you bring to bear from the 1992, 1996 experiences?
Well, I want to pick up on various of those threads, but I also want to note the fact that that was also an election 1992, when we had an independent candidate who in some ways helped foreshadow Donald Trump, and that was Ross Perot, a sort of celebrity businessman who ended up getting nearly 20% of the national popular vote, the most of any independent candidate in the last century or more, other than former President Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. And that was also a year in which the incumbent Republican president in 1992, George Bush, faced a challenge within his own party from Pat Buchanan, who again is sort of a Trump, he's part of the Trump ancestral tree. It's Pat Buchanan who emphasized the phrase "America First," who talked about building along the Mexican border a Buchanan fence. And so that's an aspect of 1992 I wanted to mention. But the points you referred to, the fact that, and this actually goes back to 1968, that in contrast to all of previous American history, the normal governing situation in the United States has become what political scientists call divided government, where the president's party does not also control Congress. Now, in Clinton's case, as with George W. Bush after him, as with Barack Obama and Donald Trump after him, he had a Democratic Congress, a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress for the first 2 years. But as with those other presidents, with the exception of George W. Bush, he lost it in that first midterm election, which just perpetuated the kind of ongoing sense among both political parties that there's no point in becoming the loyal opposition, that really your best strategy is to become, as you quoted me in the book, out there to conquer the opposition rather than to merely defeat them. And yet, in one of the things that Clinton found out, and I think Joe Biden, who also apparently, I think the odds are he's going to face a Republican Senate from the outset, is that sometimes having the opposition party in control of one or both houses of Congress gives the president a little bit of leverage against maybe the most sort of ideologically adamant elements of his own party. Clearly, Joe Biden was presiding over a sort of temporarily united Democratic Party in this campaign, united in wanting to get Donald Trump out of office, and that's been accomplished. And now, with that accomplished, the divisions within the Democratic Party, his own preference for a kind of moderate liberal approach to most issues, and yet the activism on the progressive end of the party. With a Republican Senate, assuming he gets one, he may be able to at least fend off some of the pressures to go farther left than certainly those elements in his party would like him to go.
Well, we'll come back a little later to the follow-up elections in Georgia and talk more about the parties. But before getting to the headliner of the 2020 elections, there were a lot of important elections below the national level. And there were also numerous interesting ballot initiatives in various states. They haven't gotten as much attention for understandable reasons, but what do you see going, what was noteworthy in some of those states and some of those initiatives?
Well, up and down the ballot, this was a good election for the Republican Party. Even losing the presidency, Donald Trump got more votes than any winning presidential candidate in any previous election. He got 70 plus million votes, up about 7 million from 4 years ago. Now, obviously not more than Biden. That's popular votes we're talking about. But in the U.S. Senate elections, Democrats expected to gain a majority. The only issue seemed to be how big a majority. And now I think it's unlikely they will get a clear majority of 51. I think it's unlikely they will get even up to a token majority, working majority of 50 plus Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker in the Senate. U.S. House elections, again, the expectation was the Democrats would add another 10 to 15 seats. Now the question is, how many will they lose? It'll probably be somewhere between 10 and 15. And then you go further down the ballot. The elections for state legislature this year were unusually important because in most states, the legislatures that come out of the 2020 election with a majority in each of their chambers, those are the legislators that are going to be redrawing the and state legislative district boundaries for the next 10 years in light of the results of the 2020 census. Democrats made a real run at taking some legislative houses away from the Republicans, and in every instance failed. The Republicans actually picked up both the House and Senate in New Hampshire. So you look at the landscape now, out of the 99 legislative chambers in the 50 states, 2 in almost all of them, and Nebraska being the unicameral exception, Republicans control 61 out of those 99 legislative chambers. They picked up, not many states elect their governor in a presidential election year, but the Republicans picked up a net of 1 in those. And so I think aside from losing the presidency, which is a big aside, the Republican Party should feel very good about how they came out of this election.
One commentator, Noah Rothman of Commentary Magazine, in fact, suggested a few days ago that what the voters did was remove Donald Trump with a surgical strike without doing any collateral damage to the Republican Party. And that leaves the party in great shape. Would you agree with that theory of the case?
Well, it leaves the party with a set of questions that maybe the party wouldn't have had if Trump had lost more decisively than he did, and if the Republicans had lost the Senate, and so on down the line. Because if that had been the case, then I think the Republican Party could have sort of focused on the question of how do we move away from the Donald Trump era in our party, and in some ways reconnect with our pre-Trump legacy, our history. The fact that the party did reasonably well this year, and that Trump came pretty close, means that that issue is not resolved. That the Republican Party has got some re-examining to do, but one of the live options in that re-examination is sort of staying the course. The phrase "Trumpism without Trump" is one you hear. And honestly, when I look at the course of this election and the results of this election, it's hard to imagine Donald Trump having lost it had he had the coronavirus not come along, and had he not handled it so badly. The fact that he came so close to victory in the face of the coronavirus fiasco, I think shows how strong he would have been otherwise. So Trumpism, and those who will argue that should be the future course of the Republican Party, stripped of maybe the personality of Donald Trump, although that won't be easy to do, but as an agenda, to the extent that those who advocate that course are talking about, well, we're sort of a white working class party now, with some ability to reach out to Latino voters, which took a lot of people by surprise. We're not the party of college educated voters anymore. Republicans only got 30% of the votes this year from college educated people. The Democrats got 40%. So in some way, for the Republican Party to approach an agenda of Trumpism without Trump means abandoning things that used to be Republican orthodoxy: entitlement reform, immigration reform, free trade. I'm not sure that those Republicans who are advocating a sort of a return to normalcy in the agenda are going to find much to be happy about in this year's election, because it wasn't the kind of repudiation of Trump and Trumpism that would have made that course of action clear.
So you're saying perhaps the era of worrying about big government is over for
I think that's well said.
Republican.
Dan is very cleverly quoting Bill Clinton's line from his 1996 State of the Union address. The era of big government is over. And certainly one thing you saw with Donald Trump was he didn't care about big government. He didn't care about deficits. This was true even before the pandemic. He didn't care about reining in Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. And in some ways that was liberating for a Republican Party that was always having to sort of tell the country, you need to go to the dentist, you need to get those things fixed. And Trump is, Dick Cheney, when he was vice president, said deficits don't matter. Reagan proved that. Well, I think in some ways, neither party today is showing any interest in reducing budget deficits. Even Bill Biden, who's talking about raising some taxes, is also talking about a range of programs that will cost more money than those taxes will bring in. So, yeah, I mean that those days are at least temporarily gone, pending some sort of fiscal crisis that manifests itself in spiraling inflation, spiraling interest rates, and so on, if that in fact ever happens.
The suburbs, relatedly, the suburbs were the big story of the 2018 midterms, and Trump underperformed with college-educated suburbanites confirming your view, and I think it was Jim Caesar's view too, that what we're looking at are two Americas, college and non-college. But down ballot congressional candidates outperformed Trump this time. So with Trump gone, do you think that there is a chance for those suburban voters to come back to the Republican Party, or is it the case that we are going to see a realignment within the party and between the parties, and this will in fact be a populist, possibly multiracial coalition, but it'll be blue collar workers, not middle class voters?
Suburbs I'm not even sure it's a useful category anymore, because the idea of the suburbs as the ring of towns and counties surrounding a big city that consisted of basically middle-class white people who wanted to leave the city behind and move out and get away from the city's problems, and also own a home with a yard and so on. Suburbs now, it's a category almost like Latino, that is no longer a terribly descriptive category, because it includes so many different kinds of people, so many different kinds of communities. And that's one reason why I think that, in a sense, the suburbs are politically defined right now, because there's so much variety within them. I'll say this about the down ballot elections. I think, for one thing, let's not overlook the fact that 2 years ago, the Democrats picked up 41 seats in the House, which means that their targets of opportunity this year were much smaller. The fact that they expected to gain more seats, I think, was sort of irrational exuberance on their part. But to the extent that that irrational exuberance was affecting the strategy that Democratic congressional candidates used in some of the suburban districts in Texas, for example, and those candidates perhaps overconfident and pushing a much more liberal agenda than was going to work in those districts. Maybe that's why Biden carried districts that House Democrats didn't in some cases. But that can be, the party presumably will learn from that experience and get back in the game. And with any luck, both of these political parties have been around a long time. And that's because they have adapted to changing political circumstances. So, the Republican and Democratic parties, as we've been sort of talking about indirectly so far, they are both in an ongoing effort to respond to changing market conditions, to respond to what will enable them to win elections. And that's how they've stayed in business this long. They've shown a record of being pretty good at that. And I expect a lot of, adaptations in both parties, Republicans wanting to figure out what can we do to regain the presidency, and Democrats trying to figure out what can we do to be more effective in elections further down the ballot.
Speaking of adapting to changing circumstances, campaigning wasn't the same this time around because of the pandemic, especially on the Democratic side. Trump continued to hold his rallies. An awful lot of money was spent, however, and maybe that was part of the irrational exuberance. $100 million spent in several failed Senate campaigns on the Democratic side. Is campaigning, though, going to come back to normal, do you think, or have things changed with the way money is going to be used and micro-targeting of voters? Are we going to see door-to-door kind of grassroots campaigning again at the same level?
I don't see why we wouldn't. I mean, assuming that we get through the pandemic and get back to something approaching normal in terms of people's comfort with face-to-face contact. That doesn't mean that some of the ways both parties figured out how to reach voters this year without that kind of traditional contact, they'll be there too. I think campaigning is going to be more like it used to be and more like it was this year. It'll be sort of drawing on all those elements in terms of what works. For money, let me insert one of my sort of standard political money, which I don't think Democrats really get, because I think their assumption is money equals political power. And the more money that you spend on a political campaign, the greater your likelihood of winning. My image, and this is one I know, Dan, you can relate to, is it's like a campaign is like a high stakes poker game. You've got to have enough money to play. You've got to have enough money to ante up. And in campaign terms, you've got to have enough money to be able to get your message through to voters. But above and beyond that sort of threshold amount, then additional money is only doing you good to the extent that it's deployed skillfully. We saw in South Carolina this year, which is not a big state, an expensive state to run in. We saw in South Carolina this year, the Democratic nominee raise more than any candidate for the U.S. Senate in any state in any year has raised, $100 million. And he ended up losing by about what you'd expect a Democrat to lose by in South Carolina. He ended up losing by about 12 points. The money that got poured into Kentucky for Mitch McConnell's opponent. And then guess what? She ends up losing by an overwhelming landslide. So money is to the extent that anybody assumes that the more money a candidate has, above a certain threshold, above what you need to get your message out. I had Ken Mellman, who used to be the chair of the Republican National Committee and ran George W. Bush's campaign in 2004. And in that year, this is the old days, they ran their campaign based on the amount of money that the federal government was willing to give candidates if they agreed to spend only that. It was $75 million for a presidential campaign in 2004. And Millman said, you know, there is a limit to how much money you can spend effectively. And if you've got more than that amount, then who knows where that money is going? And is it in service of a consistent strategy, or do people have so much money in the campaign they can spend it on basically whatever they want? And by the way, also in a state like South Carolina, if you're raising that amount of money, most of it coming from out of state, you're handing it to your opponent, which is, you know, in this case, California Hollywood liberals, you know, are trying to buy the U.S. Senate seat in our state of South Carolina. So I think there may be some recalibrating about the relationship between the amount of money you can spend and effective use of that money, which at some point, if it becomes ineffective, actually becomes counterproductive to a campaign.
Well, that's I agree with you. I think that's been proven true. Although radio station owners don't want to hear about it. That's a career possibility for our senior graduating students. Perhaps you might consider. That said, though, aren't you expecting that new records will be set between now and January 5th in Georgia?
Oh, yes, because that's, you know, I mean, how often do you have, and by the way, Georgia is peculiar in this way. I love the state of Georgia, but the fact that getting more votes than your opponent on election day is not enough by itself to win you the election, that unless that plurality actually crosses over into a majority, you've got to go into a runoff election. I won't even go into the complications in the other Senate race there, but clearly the Democrats' only hope of denying the Republicans control of the Senate is to win both those seats. And Republicans obviously know this too. And I don't know that anything can sort of resist I don't know if the lessons have sunk in that you and I have learned, Dan, that more money doesn't necessarily mean a better campaign. I think the stakes are so high that you know, Atlanta television stations and radio stations will be maybe the flushest in the country. But I think it's going to be hard for the Democrats to win both of those Georgia elections, in part because of something we talked about earlier. And that is the voters' habit over the last 52 years, since 1968, of most of the time sort of liking divided government. Now, I think generally they're wrong to like it, but you know, what do I know? And I think there's a certain sense, and Georgia is a state where this argument may resonate. You know, the Democrats have the House, the Democrats have the White House. Do we really want to contribute to having all the elected branches of government in Washington be in the control of the Democratic Party? So I don't bet on politics because I know how often I would have lost those bets, which is most of the time. But I will predict here that the Democrats will not win both those Senate seats in Georgia. And in fact, I think it's more likely than not that they will lose both of them.
Interesting, because there really wasn't split ticket voting in this election, was there, outside of the state of Maine? But you're suggesting that now the Georgia voters have a second shot at it and might indeed choose divided government for the purpose of moderating a Biden administration as befits a country that itself remains divided. It's a sophisticated position for voters to take, but
I mean, if we learn nothing else about Georgia this year, which Trump carried by 5 points 4 years ago, it's essentially a 50-50 state. So if a relatively small number of voters make up their minds on the basis of, I really don't want to see the Democrats have complete control of the federal government, that in such a closely balanced state would be enough Now, the other question is turnout. I mean, people who voted in the election that ended in most ways last Tuesday, this was the big ticket item in terms of attracting voters to participate, and a record number for the last however many years did. Can you get those same people to come out in the same numbers in January for basically a much more limited pair of elections? I just don't know. Both parties will be trying their best. This, in many ways, will be a turnout election. But if both parties, do essentially what they were able to do this time and turn out about the same number of voters in Georgia, if 1 or 2% of those voters would have voted Democratic, but don't really want to see the Republicans shut out of power in Washington, that's all it'll take.
Right. So some of the questions from the attendees want to pick up on this theme. It's a bit of a potpourri, and some of them I think you just covered recently, but you can elaborate as you see fit. One is, do you see Biden moderating his policies to pass things with Republicans, or listening to the calls of the progressive wing of the party in order to prevent further internal fracturing? You touched on that, but maybe you could comment on this as well. If it's a close division, 50-52, 48, there's still Lisa Murkowski, there's still Mitt Romney, there's still Susan Collins there, who have proven in the past that they're willing to break party ranks. What kind of I guess I'm asking, does Mitch McConnell have all the leverage in this negotiating relationship we're anticipating?
Well, he will have a lot of leverage if his party has a majority, because that means his party will have all the committee chairmanships, subcommittee chairmanships, and he will have as majority leader a great deal of control over the Senate's agenda. And he and Biden, though, this is a sort of forgotten chapter of the Obama presidency when Biden was vice president, and for a time there was a serious effort of both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue to come up with some major meaning, unprecedentedly major deal about deficit reduction, and that fell apart mostly because of House Republicans not wanting to get involved. But Biden and McConnell, they were trying to get to yes. So that's not to say that nothing has changed since Obama was president, but certainly Biden and McConnell have a history of trying to find agreement on some things. The big agenda items that Biden will be having to start his administration with are, I think, matters that are not intrinsically divisive. Everybody wants to see the country get a handle on the pandemic. Everybody wants to see and these two things are related, wants to see the economy come back, wants to see small businesses that have had to shut down come back to life, people to get their jobs back. So in that sense, he's not coming in with an ideological agenda that is sort of fixed in place. He'll be dealing with things that everybody wants to see get solved, and that may ease the challenge of fostering some degree of bipartisan cooperation. Now, I'll say this: Biden will definitely be attentive to keeping the left wing of his party, if not satisfied, at least pacified. And that will come through, I think, to a large degree, through executive orders on things like rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, on things like restoring the path to citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. Will include things like, we could go right on down a long list. And I think he will also do his best to pacify the voices on the left in his party through appointments to some degree to the cabinet, and the White House staff, but mostly further down in the ranks of the executive departments. It's the assistant secretaries of the various departments who end up making a lot of decisions that are underneath sort of the public gaze, but that that either satisfy or dissatisfy particular constituencies. And so I would watch for a lot of the most liberal measures of the Biden administration to be ones that we don't notice, but that, say, environmental activists notice, gender rights advocates notice, and so on down the list.
So will you expect that the recent revision of the Title IX guidelines from Betsy DeVos will be one of the first things to be reversed back, so to speak?
That'll be hard because as the Trump administration found out, when you try through executive action to undo a regulation or a set of regulations that have gotten onto the books through the elaborate process required by federal law, it's not a matter of just saying, we're going to reverse those. You've got to, in effect, inaugurate your own process to show that the existing regulation is unreasonable. Those Title IX regulations that became so controversial weren't even regulations. They were simply guidelines that came from the Education Department under Obama. Well, guidelines have no force of law, even though a lot of colleges and universities took them that way. They weren't. But the Education Department under President Trump went through, they did the hard work. They did the painstaking work of creating Title IX regulations that are pretty securely embedded in federal law that can be undone, but not undone by the stroke of a pen, the way some of these other things that Biden will be able to do can be undone.
So here's just one quick follow-up on the Biden-McConnell relationship. It comes from Mark Pullman, actually. If Republicans retain their Senate majority, will McConnell be willing to bring forward any Biden judicial nominees for a floor vote?
That is a great question, and I do not have even an okay answer. Certainly Mitch McConnell has shown an almost obsessive interest in who ends up serving on the federal courts. And in Donald Trump, he had a willing partner. Is he going to abandon that interest when now a Democratic president is making nominations? I just don't know. I imagine that at least at the outset, I mean, he won't be able for 4 years to say we're not going to confirm anybody. But will they look for sort of Democratic nominees to federal judgeships who have written things or said things in the past that can be sort of highlighted and made to seem beyond the bounds of acceptability? Yeah, I think they'll be looking for those, even at the level of district court judges.
Here's I mentioned this is a potpourri. What aspects of Trumpism do you think will remain important to the Republican Party? What aspects will the party gladly try to distance itself from?
Well, there are dark aspects, clearly dark aspects of Trumpism, and it's basically his sort of ongoing. I won't even say campaign, but his ongoing reflex of playing on resentments that white people may have about progress for minorities. I really, we're a country with a lot of fault lines in it, and to have a president who sort of aggravates those fault lines is something that I would hope a Trumpism without Trump would put behind it. The aspects of Trumpism that the party could build on would be basically to say, we're now the party of the white working class. We've shown some ability in this election, despite Trump's insulting language about Latinos. We've shown some ability to win votes among Latinos. They want to be in the, they're striving to be in the middle class too. They're striving to preserve sort of Republican versions of traditional family values. That, it may be that the party just sort of looks at what have we got now coming out of this election? What groups in the electorate are ours? and say, well, what can we do to build our agenda, our policy agenda, around the legitimate concerns of those people, and come up with policies that acknowledge that. So a Trumpism without Trump could turn into something that is a viable course forward for the Republican Party that at least would sort of fit the nation's tradition of two parties offering reasonable, if differing, agendas. So I hope that the Republican Party's response to this will not be to sort of double down on all things Trump, including his style of doing things, but rather will sort of involve, okay, what can we learn? What can we salvage from the experience of Donald Trump's administration, and build on and channel into more constructive directions.
So on the subject of Trumpism without Trump, or just without Trumpism, one questioner is asking about the importance historically of concession speeches. When have they mattered? Why have they mattered? Trump is leaving the White House, but it's not clear yet he's going to get a damage deposit back. How do you see this?
Well, I'm laughing, but I'm not laughing about the prospect of Trump not sort of cowboying up and doing things that you just do because you're the president, and part of your job is to leave the White House with a certain amount of grace. Donald Trump has done. You can't tell Donald Trump. You've never been able to tell Donald Trump, well, here's the way presidents behave just because they're president, just because it's the one office in the country that in some ways at least is supposed to represent everybody. He showed a disregard for doing that, and frankly got to be president by without having to sort of pay homage to the things the presidents do. Think about the ways in which in previous administrations, for example, when there was a national disaster of some kind, whether it was Ronald Reagan after the Challenger disaster, or Bill Clinton after the Oklahoma City bombing, or George W. Bush after 9/11, how in every one of those times of great national fear and uncertainty, and the president sort of rose to the occasion and reminded us of what unifies us as a people. Inaugural addresses have usually taken that form. Donald Trump has done none of those things. So I like to think that he'll have sort of a political deathbed conversion, and on his way out the door, actually say, okay, I've explored all my legal avenues. By the way, I don't criticize Trump for, wanting a recount in Georgia and wanting to pursue questions about, how elections were conducted. You're entitled to do that if you lose the close elections. But I would hope that once he's sort of done that, he will, for the first time, show the kind of grace in defeat that we expect of presidents. And, people have made a lot out of this, and I think it's a false narrative, that it's very unusual for an incumbent president to lose an election. Hasn't happened since 1992, as if that were, sometime in the BC era. Yeah, we've had a number of those elections. We've had Gerald Ford, we've had Jimmy Carter, we've had George Bush, and prior to that, we had LBJ who withdrew in the face of defeat. Harry Truman in 1952 decided not to run again in the face of defeat. Calvin Coolidge in 1928. We've had presidents before who have basically had the option of getting reelected and did not. So Trump can learn a lot from the way in which these losers, so to speak, conducted themselves on the way out the door.
It's interesting. Bill Galston, longtime Democratic consultant and Clinton administration person, said a couple of days ago that Trump has been defeated, but he's not leaving in disgrace, and he doesn't have to leave in in disgrace because he almost did it. And that's a message that perhaps hasn't really sunk in on the president himself, but that seems to be true given your comment before about the unexpected, how close he came to pulling off the unexpected. Going back to the theme of divided government, here's an interesting question. You mentioned that the public seems to like divided government, but what do we make then of the fact that the public also likes to give such a low approval rating to Congress because of its inability to pass important measures, which is difficult because of divided government?
Well, that's almost a cultural trope. I mean, Mark Twain, I'm going to get this wrong, but famously said something like, well, I'm going to get it wrong, but the idea of thinking of Congress as sort of an almost comically inept and to some degree even dubiously honest institution. Those polls that show public approval for Congress, I think you set them side by side with which incumbent members of Congress get reelected, and clearly there's some sort of disconnect there. Now, I think the downside of divided government, and the reason why, in general, I regret the fact that this has become so normal in our political experience, is that it sort of gives the Republican and Democratic Party incentives to kind of dig in opposition. And it's turned in many ways the judicial branch into a political football that, a Democratic Congress kicks back and forth with a Republican president or vice versa. You mentioned earlier, judicial nominations under Joe Biden, if the Republicans still have the Senate. The one thing we can count on is that it won't be the way it was 30, 40 years ago, when customarily senators of the opposition party their default setting would be to confirm judicial nominees, because the assumption was someday the shoe will be on the other foot, and we'll want to have our president's nominations confirmed by senators of the other party. That's just no longer the case. And what does that do to the judiciary when people talk about the Supreme Court, for example, in terms of here are the Republican appointees and here are the Democratic appointees? At what point does that become corrosive of the court's authority? And divided government, I think, fosters this attitude that judicial nominations are just another arena of partisan and interbranch warfare. And judicial authority, over time, relies on some deference to the idea that judges really are standing outside of partisan politics and making decisions based on an honest reading of the law.
You said a little bit about what the future of the Republican Party might hold, or at least the kind of postmortem that they're likely to conduct. Here's a question about the Democrats. How do the Democrats widen their tent more to include and reach out to the Trump voter? Is this even possible? The questioner asks.
Well, we've heard the voices already from sort of moderate liberal congressional Democrats who are participating in their party's postmortem, trying to explain, why is it that we thought we were going to win seats and instead we're going to lose seats, and now we're sort of hanging on to majority control of the House of Representatives by a thread. And their voice, what we're hearing from them is, things that resonate entirely with the progressive elements in the party. Defund the police, open borders, Green New Deal, Medicare for all. That those are things that if you're once you step outside the urban liberal, overwhelmingly Democratic districts, don't play very well in other parts of the country. And so I wonder, the extent to which the party will, and by the way, Nancy Pelosi, I think, is somebody who's always focused on what will win elections for Democrats. She's often caricatured by Republicans as a far-out liberal, but she is the most practical politician. What will win elections for Democrats, especially in the House of Representatives? And I suspect that she's going to be trying to, as the 2022 midterm election nears, make sure that the party is encouraging the nomination of candidates for open seats or Republican seats that are not echoing AOC and the others in the progressive cohort. And I expect that she's going to want to see those grassroots cultivated.
Sunday morning, Jim Clyburn, who did make the Biden presidency happen, called out the defund the police talk, and in very strong terms said, enough with this. This is not the message we want to send. It sounds to me like you expect there won't be a challenge to Pelosi's leadership in particular as the next Congress convenes, but the Democratic Party is now really a gerontocracy.
It is.
Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. Is it imaginable that'll continue for the next 4 years?
2 years anyway. But the actuarial tables have not been repealed, and at some point having the top three leaders in the House of Representatives, Democratic Party, Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Jim Clyburn, they're all 80 or approaching 80. The President of the United States is going to turn 80 2 years from now. Obviously, they can't stay in power forever. Although I'll just digress a bit and say, I think it would be a mistake for Joe Biden to kind of signal very clearly that he's abandoning the possibility of running for a second term. I think to sort of turn yourself into a lame duck when there's no need to do that would be a mistake. But there's no doubt that in Congress, the Democratic Party is going to undergo a generational change. It has to. I think Pelosi and Hoyer and Clyburn are safe for the next couple of years. But beyond that, and then the question is, okay, what wing of the Democratic Party in the House and in the Senate as well, not too far down the road, what wing of the party is going to dominate the choice of the next generation of Democratic leaders? And that, to me, has a big question mark hanging over it.
Here's another question that brings us back to Trump and Trumpism. Do you see any chance that Trump, should he concede once it's clear the recounts won't help and leaves office without breaking the china, that Trump might continue to be a voice within the party, maybe even seek the presidency again in 2024?
Oh, I don't. Donald Trump, the idea of Donald Trump stepping away from the spotlight, I mean, when in his life has he ever done that? So that's just the idea that he's going to now say, well, okay, I've been president and everything else. I'm now going to go, tend my garden. No, and I doubt he's going to make a declaration of non-candidacy for 2024. I think he wants that sort of hanging over the realm of possibility, especially if Biden, if there's any chance Biden might run again. So no, I think Trump is going to be allowed, and he's not going to do what presidents usually do when they leave office, which is to spend their time raising a lot of money to build their presidential library and come up with some sort of mission for that library, and then devote a lot of time to writing their memoirs and sort of stepping outside of the political spotlight while they're doing those things, and sort of as a gesture of respect to the fact that you've got a new president and you don't want to seem like a government in exile. No, Trump's gonna be around, and I think we saw when Biden's de facto victory was declared, there were initially some Republicans who stepped forward to sort of say, well, this is the new reality. And then Donald Trump Jr. calls them out. Where are the Republicans stepping forward and saying this election's not over yet? And boom, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and the whole gang,
Haley.
Nikki Haley, all of those who are thinking, I'd like to be the nominee for president in 2024. And I know that's not going to happen if I make an enemy out of Donald Trump. They all sort of jumped up and saluted. So over time, his hold on the party, personal hold, is bound to decline because he's old, right? He's not going to be around forever. But he's not going to make it easy for the Republican Party to step away from any of the aspects of Trump's leadership, including the ones I talked about earlier, as not only as the ones that are, even from the narrowest political sense, counterproductive.
Yeah, not one to walk away from brand equity. We've got time for just one more question, Mike, and you'll like this because it's going back to historical reference points with 68 and 92 in mind. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the direction of the coarseness of partisan rhetoric, Democrats and Republicans as enemies rather than opponents, socialism label, radical left, et cetera, and B, lack of bipartisan cooperation, more interest in blocking rather than enacting legislation, party line impeachment votes, the aftermath of the Merrick Garland and Amy Coney Barrett nominations.
Well, if you take a close-up look at American politics today, it's really easy to become awfully pessimistic awfully fast and not see sort of any way to get us beyond the angry polarization that we're in now. But I think if you stand back and take a broader historical perspective, I mean, we've come through some things that are a lot worse than this, including a civil war, including a Great Depression. And in 1968, I got to tell you, the big question that hovered over the country in 1968 was, is America coming apart? Not just politically, but is America coming apart at the seams, generationally, racially, ideologically, and in every other way? And here we are. We're still standing. So that's the basis for my optimism, is that we've been doing this for a long time. We've got a constitutional system of government that, because power is sliced and diced within Washington, between the branches of government, and then within the federal system, between the federal and state governments, there's a lot of ways in which groups that might sort of feel like they're frozen out now. There are a lot of ways to get back into the process. The political parties are remarkably open to change, and again, that's why those two parties are still around. It's because they've adapted. So I don't know what the shape of optimism is now, but nothing tells me that America is not capable of overcoming greater crises and greater divisions than are the case today.
Well, I think that's a great way to stop. And thanks, Mike, so much for doing this. You've been, I know you've been busy since last Tuesday, nonstop. Thanks to all of you for attending, and special thanks to Kim Bennett of Rhodes College for making all this go smoothly. Thank you all.
Thank you, David.